Welcome everyone to this month's SuSanA webinar. This is part of a monthly series that we run, and this is hosted by the Stockholm Environment Institute and the SuSanA Secretariat, which is the Sustainable Sanitation Alliance, for those of you that aren't familiar with SuSanA. Today, the webinar will last around 45 minutes, and we'll have two presentations for about half an hour, and then we'll have about 15-20 minutes for discussion at the end. And we want to ensure this is as engaging and as interactive as possible. So during the discussion, you're welcome to turn on your mic. You can turn on your webcam during the whole webinar so that we can get to know you. So please think about your questions during the presentations. I'll do my best to take questions from the chat as well. And we look forward to a really interesting presentation today. As you know, we're talking about climate change and the water and the wastewater sector. And today our presenters come from GIZ. First, Dr. Astrid Michels, and she is the project manager of the Water and Wastewater Companies for Climate Change Mitigation Project. And Astrid will be followed by Willie Alarcon, who is the Senior Advisor of the WACLIME Financing and Carbon Market Project. So I think we can get started, and we'll move on to Astrid's presentation.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. So the topic is, the first part of the presentation is climate change and water. And it's a very broad, a very big topic. I'm going to talk first about climate change, so there's a little bit of an emphasis on the climate change perspective. Then I'm going to talk about water and climate change and what is the connections. And then about the future, what are the trends in water in the future? And what kind of impact does climate change have, and where do the action areas lie? And then lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the international climate debate and try to introduce some of the many abbreviations that are used but that are quite relevant for the water and sanitation sector as well. So climate change is a global problem that requires international cooperation and coordination across scales. It is clear, and there is enough scientific evidence, that anthropogenic activities have led to a significant temperature increase since the 1950s, and there is an energy increase of 90% currently, a net energy increase, and 90% of that energy is actually stored in the oceans. Climate change, if we're continuing with emitting carbon emissions at the same level as we do, then by the end of the 21st century, we are expecting a temperature increase of 2.6 to 4.5 degrees. And what you can see in this graph is the different red or purple colors show the degree of risk for different type of events, of extreme events. So what we're expecting is longer heat waves, more and stronger extreme weather events. And without additional mitigation, as I already mentioned, the temperature is going to continue to increase. So what is the actual connection between water and climate change? And climate change is affecting the temperature, and the temperature rise in the atmosphere and in the ocean is affecting weather patterns, so it is affecting our precipitations. So precipitations are going to become much less predictable, much higher intensity, and there will be less, like glaciers are going to melt. Ongoing with this, it is expected that sea levels are rising. Some of these patterns affect our affect the discharge in the rivers, and one of the consequences, for example, is that you are going to have much higher sedimentation loads because precipitation patterns are going to be much more intense. We can also look at the groundwater, and groundwater is also going to be affected in different ways. So the whole water cycle is in one or the other way affected. And 80% of all climate change impacts are channeled through water. In this slide, I was trying to simplify some of those impacts that I just mentioned. So we have the changing weather patterns that ultimately affect water quality and water quantity. So quality of groundwater is going to be affected, more contamination, eutrophication is going to increase, algal blooms, sedimentation. And when we look at water quantity and water stress, for example, runoff and discharge is changing, glaciers are melting, and there is an increased risk for both flooding and droughts. So how does all this impact on societies? There is, the UN has introduced, or we have recently heard much more about water security, and water security has many different dimensions, and this is according to UN 4, and some of this is covered in this slide. So climate change is affecting ecosystems. It's affecting the environmental health of the ecosystems. It is also affecting the livelihood of people, and there are more and more people migrating and forced to leave their areas because of water stress. At the same time, it does affect our food security, because if there isn't enough water anymore for agriculture, we can't produce sufficient food. But it also affects our energy security. Example in Ecuador, where you have a lot of the energy is based on hydro energy, but based on all these differences in precipitation patterns, there is huge risks to energy security now because the rivers don't carry the same discharge that was planned for when the dams were built. And then water security or climate change is also then affecting the private sector and the economy. And ultimately can also, water stress can lead to increased poverty. Future trends, the World Economic Forum has in 2014 announced that water crises are ranked as the top global risk. And about 1/3 of the world's population already lives in water-stressed areas. And predictions are then by 2030 there will be half of the world's population living in water-stressed area. So climate change poses an additional threat to water security. And this is shown in the two graphs too, when you see that while the demand for water is supposed to rise by 55%, water availability is going down by 40%. And the graph on the right side here is actually showing how discharge is going to change over time, and it is showing the deviation. So you have little deviation in the MENA region because there is little discharge already. So you have to look at the red areas. Those are the areas that are going to become much more water stressed in the future. I would like now to point or to think about the water cycle or the water sector and its role and in climate change. And then we have on the one side, like climate change is triggered by emissions, so increase of CO2 emissions, and it is affecting livelihoods and our ecosystems. So there is a need to adapt to climate change and to become more resilient. At the same time, societies and increased population is also leading to more stress on water, and the water sector itself is contributing to emissions through, for example, the energy intensity in wastewater treatment or energy intensity of water intensive industries. So the water sector itself is also contributing to emissions. So on one hand, we have to adapt, But on the other hand, we also have to contribute to look at the sources and cut sources of CO2 down. And the other important area is climate financing. We need financing for adaptation, but also for the mitigation part. I'm focusing here on those three areas of climate action areas, and this is more also to focus on what is happening in the international climate change debate. So when we talk about adaptation, we're talking about how can our ecosystems, how can our watersheds, how do we have to adapt in water management? And there is a need to increase the capacity to deal with floods, for example, or with droughts. And an important part for all countries is the plans, the national adaptation plans that are being set up, where they contribute and where they state what has to be, where their focus is going to be in terms of the climate change actions. And vulnerability and climate risk analysis is also an important action item because we do need data to identify and scenarios to know where are going to be, in which areas, which watersheds are the risks going to be. When we're looking at the mitigation part, there is three main areas. One is decarbonizing and developing low emission strategies. National appropriate mitigation actions is a very important term where you determine mitigation actions for different sectors, and we're going to talk about what this means for the water sector later. And a big portion of this is also monitoring because the contributions need to be monitored, reported. From a financing point of view, financial governance is an important area, action area for the countries that are implementing either adaptation or mitigation actions to access funding. The private sector engagement is important to mobilize additional funds and carbon market. And on the left side, I was trying to show what does this actually mean for our sector. So what does this mean for the future? So new infrastructure has to become climate proof and more resilient for the future. And existing infrastructure has to be retrofitted to adapt or to be capable to adapt to either the changes of having coping with not enough water or too much water. We have to in the water sector too, data information is more important. Data information and collecting data, monitoring data to have a better understanding of the uncertainty and of the extremes that we are expecting. Health impacts have to be carefully considered because with increased flooding and when we're thinking of the sanitation sector and flooding of latrines and then we do have contamination going in the environment. So going along with this, there is also good practices in hygienes that are more and more important with climate change impact. And we also have to consider, in order to finally cut sources, we have to consider the greenhouse gas implications of all the measures. I'm going to skip quickly through this slide. It's about climate action areas that require cooperation across scales, and it is different organizations that are involved. And I'd like to get to the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions. Paris Agreement stated that there is a commitment to temperature rise, to stop temperature rise at 1.5 degrees, and 90% of all these contributions that have been submitted by countries do mention adaptation in the water sector. And the topics in this is agricultural water, risk management, integrated water management, drinking water. So water action priorities are infrastructure, information systems, and strengthening institutional and regulatory frameworks. If we are summing up all the NDCs so far, this is not going to be sufficient to stop climate change or to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius. Currently, it is sufficient to actually reach 2.7 to 3.5 degrees. So there is much more ambition needed. Here is just to show you the different priority areas in adaptation actions, and with purple you can find the water and sanitation areas for the different countries here, Africa, Asia, for the different continents, I'm sorry. So this is like sanitation and water mentioned in the national determined contributions of these countries. Quick journey to what is happening from a water sector point of view that is important for the international discussions and for politics. The high-level panel on water that has been launched in April this year with the core focus to achieve water-related SDGs, SDG 6, and implementation. And it does focus on the point that water is a connector, and water connects people, public health, food security, livable cities, environmental well-being. Some of the international initiatives on water and climate, and I'm not going to go into details, this was an attempt that we have done to show those are different organizations and initiatives. Some of them launched during the COP21. I think a lot of you may know AGUA. But it is interesting to see there is much more going on also to try to lift or to put the importance of water in the climate change agenda. And what are the key recommendations by those organizations? Water is key topic of climate change, of the climate negotiations. The climate agenda and the implementation of the SDGs are inseparable, and implementation needs to be coherent and complementary. Co-benefits are very important, and they have to be considered and quantified. And an important area is also the strengthening of the capacity of local and regional stakeholders, and to facilitate and enhance their access to financing. All businesses, all sectors have to transform. We all have to go away from business as usual and have to transform, and the water sector has to transform as well in order to make that goal happen. And here is like to transition to the next topic, what it is about what does mitigation in the water sector mean. And this is showing here that in order to reach the 2-degree goal, more than 50% of the carbon budget has already been used. So we have to cut down to zero emissions very soon to achieve this goal. I'd like to thank you for your attention now, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And I'd like to hand over now to Willie, who talks more specifically about mitigation in the water sector.